Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today I'm doing my May wrap-up, but before I dive into the wrap-up, I want to direct you guys to the description box below where there will be resources and links to support the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm sure that you're all aware of the protests and things that have been going on since the murder of George Floyd, and it is so important that we support this movement because Black Lives Matter, but in the United States they are not treated as if they do because this country is built on white supremacy and systemic racism, and that needs to change. It has needed to change for a very long time. And it should not have taken so much violence against the Black community and so many deaths of Black people to get to this point. But this is where we are now, and we need to make sure that this becomes a real turning point and doesn't just fade away. So please donate if you can. If you're not able to donate money, there are other ways to support this movement. There's going to be a video that you can watch that the ad revenue is going to be donated to Black Lives Matter organizations. There are petitions you can sign, and of course one of the most important things to do, especially for white people, is to educate ourselves on the history of white supremacy and systemic racism in the United States, because our education system does not teach us this, and we've had the privilege of not knowing. But that is also something that needs to change. It is incredibly important for white people to educate themselves on these issues. So there are, of course, resources all over the internet on this, and if you're watching this video, that means you have access to the internet and you can Google it. But also there are books. So since we're bookish people, reading books is a great opportunity to educate ourselves. So I'll put a list of nonfiction books in the description too. I'm reading a few of these. I'm going to be reading more of them in the future. I'm participating in the Blackout Buddyread, which is hosted by Shay from Books with Shay, and I will link the announcement video for that buddy read down below. And for that one, they're reading White Fragility and White Rage, but I'm going to be continuing my own education on these issues beyond just reading those two books, because these are large issues that are multifaceted and are deep-rooted in this country's history. So it's going to take more than just two books to really understand any significant portion of this issue. Also, I'm going to link some videos of Black booktubers who have made videos talking about their experiences being Black on Booktube. So I'm going to link a few of those below, but also if you just search Black Booktube or Black on Booktube on YouTube, you'll find more of these videos, and I think they are so important for us to watch and to be aware of people's experiences within this community and what our community members are experiencing. So please watch those because I think they're incredibly important. Alright, so now I'm going to get into the wrap-up. In May, I read 7 books. 2 of them were actually graphic novels, and May was kind of a weird reading month. I feel like I say that about like every month, so I don't know what I think a normal reading month is. But in May specifically, I ended up reading a lot of books that I did not really like. There were a couple that were pretty good, but for some reason, I decided in May that I wanted to read the books that are on my shelf that I think that I'm not going to like. So with my books, I kind of have like a hierarchy of like how much I think I'm going to like them, and I recently like unhauled some TBR books that I had not read because I just knew like I don't think I'm gonna like these, I'm gonna get rid of them. But then there's like one tier up, which is books that I think I'm not going to like, or I think I might not like, but there's like a glimmer of potential that means I'm not willing to part with them without at least giving them a chance. So I decided to try and get through a few of those books that are on my shelf this month and either read them or DNF them so that I could make a real decision. But that meant that I ended up having a lot of books this month that I just didn't like. And they weren't, for the most part, they weren't great. There were a couple that were pretty good, but for the most part, I didn't really like my reading in May. So this is going to be a relatively negative wrap-up. But let's just get started. Okay, so the first book that I read in May actually was one that I really enjoyed, which was Wolfe Speaker by Tamara Pierce. This is a reread. This is the second book in the Immortals Quartet, which was one of my favorite series as a kid. So of course in this we're following Dane, we're following Numair, who is her teacher, and she's learning more about her magic and her capabilities, learning new skills, new facets to her magic, which I always love in this. The story of this one is that there is a wolf pack who is having trouble with the humans that are living near them, and so the wolf pack calls in Dane, because they knew her from like years ago, to come help them. And so she and Numair go to help this wolf pack, and then find out that there are larger issues and conspiracies going on than just conflict between the wolves and the humans. And I loved rereading this. I just think Tamara Pierce does such an amazing job of like getting just the right balance of character development, story, and like plot, world building, like all of it in each book, that it's like just the right amount. And these books are pretty short. So I just had a really great time with this. In this one we get, as I was saying, more about her magic and her capabilities. We get to learn about new skills that she has. We get to find out about new magical creatures and new like immortals that are coming from the divine realms. There are characters that I had forgotten about, like there's a character named Taka who I love and I had totally forgotten was in this book. So this one I had a really fun time with. So the month started out okay, and I think I gave this one 4 stars. Next I read a graphic novel, which was Through the Woods by Emily Carroll. And so this, I didn't realize that this is actually like a series of short stories that are in graphic form. It's not like one cohesive story. So it's all these like very brief stories that feel like very like classic campfire stories that are supposed to like scare people around the campfire. I think the stories rely very heavily on the unknown. There's a lot of like leaving out information or just ending a story without any real conclusion, but it felt very purposeful in the way that it was doing that, and leaving the stories unfinished as a way of making them a little bit creepier. I didn't find these stories to be like super creepy, but it had just like a little sprinkling of the creeps. I enjoyed it overall, but it didn't leave a real impact on me. Then we had the first real like negative book of the month, which was The Unspoken Name by A.K. Larkwood. This one I had been reading for a while and finally decided to just like push myself through and make myself finish it. So this book is not at all, it was not what I was expecting it to be, because people like describe this as being about I think it's like an orc priestess who is supposed to be sacrificed to her god, and then she gets the opportunity to go like become an assassin instead, and so she runs away with this guy and learns to be an assassin. And like that happens, but also the story is a lot about her helping this guy who kind of like rescued her and took her away to become an assassin. She is helping him to regain his power, because he used to have this like city or something that he was in control of, and so his goal is to regain and maintain his power. The plot structure of this book was bizarre to me, because like the first half of the book wasn't the plot, and there were like 2 sections that were not the plot, and I kept reading this book thinking like, oh, is this the plot? Is this about to start? Okay, now maybe we're in the plot. And it kept not being the plot. The plot didn't start until halfway through the book, and this is like, I don't know, like 450 pages or something. So the first half of the book just felt like 2 very long prologues, and I don't like prologues to begin with, and then that's just a bizarre plot structure to have. And most of the stuff that happened in that first half felt very unnecessary once I realized what the actual plot was going to be in the second half. And I think that most of that information wasn't necessary and could have been accomplished through maybe a couple of brief flashbacks, but like it really did not need to be as long as it was, because most of it was pretty pointless. And part of why I felt like it was so pointless was because in order to get to where they started the plot and cover as much time as they did in that first half, it had to skip so much. And really what it did is that it skipped so much of the like experiential part of the story. It skipped all of the tough parts. It skipped all of the things that were like developing character, building relationships, characters like learning and going through things, and we never really had to experience or got to experience any of that or any of the tough parts of it or any of the struggles of these characters. There were just like large time jumps. There were parts where it would just kind of go like from her being a sheltered priestess to them being like, and then like, I don't remember if it was 1 year or 3 years later, but like, and then she learned a bunch of stuff and now she's an assassin, and you're like, there wasn't even like a lazy learning montage or anything. They were just like 3 years later, now she learned a bunch of stuff. And like, I hated that. The reason I read these books is because I want to be there and experience things with these characters, and so it just skipped all of that experiential aspect of the story. And so because all of that was skipped, then it made it feel like that whole part of the book was pointless, because then they could have just done it with a couple of flashbacks and really condensed it if they weren't going to get in depth into the more emotional or experiential part of like what it was like to go through all of that. I also felt like I never really knew the main character. I never cared about her because I felt like it missed a lot of that character building time that I wanted with the character. And then the story would just like throw in statements about her that were just like news to me. There were so many notes that I made in here where they would say something, they would make a statement about the main character whose name is Xorwe, and they would say like, Xorwe like always does this or always reacts in this way, and I would just go, since when? Since when does she always react like this? Since when does she always know this thing? Since when? You never told me this before. You never set this up. So like, why are you just telling me this now? And also, these things would happen far enough into the book that they should have set that up by now. Like, I think at the beginning of a story, making statements like that isn't necessarily the best way of writing a character, but I'm usually fine with, because at the beginning of a story, I'm kind of like, yeah, I don't know this character, tell me about them. But at a certain point, you can't make statements like that anymore because you needed to set that up, and it just didn't. And so many of my notes were just going, since when? And really, all of the characters in this, I felt like I never really knew who they were. I never really understood, like, what are their motivations? Why do they do the things that they do? What are their relationships like to these other people, or other orcs? I don't know. I just felt like the characters were never really fleshed out, and characters are so important to me. I felt like the story had a lot of potential to it, and it had some interesting ideas. It had potential to be really dark and really interesting, and I was interested in this world. It had some hints of some really cool like mythology and cultures to it. And it just like, it felt like it wanted to be dark, but like didn't know how, and didn't know how to execute it. And I wish it had like leaned into that more. But ultimately, reading this, I wanted to DNF it pretty much the entire time I was reading it. And like, I kept reading because I wanted to love it. I had heard really good things about it from people that I generally like agree with on books, and I really wanted to love it. And I think that there was potential to it, and there were things in this that made me keep thinking, oh, maybe it's going to get better. Maybe if I just read another like 50 pages, that's when like it's really gonna kick in and I'm really gonna start loving it. So it like kept me on the hook the whole time. Like I read the whole book, but it never got better. And I just really didn't like it, and I gave it 2 stars. Then I read another graphic novel, which was Friends with Boys by Faith Erin Hicks. And so this is about a girl who is going to high school. She's starting her first day of high school after being homeschooled for her whole life before this point, and she's very nervous about it. And it's about her like making friends, and she has 3 older brothers, and she kind of like learns more about them from being in school with them, but also she is haunted by a ghost in this. So this one I wanted to read because I've seen it on lists for like, if you love the Raven Boys, then you would like this. And like on a surface level, like I can see why they would make that comparison, but in actuality, I would not recommend this. It was very cute. There was a lot of cute stuff about like her and the friends that she makes and her brothers and stuff, but it was also just kind of a mess, especially the part with the ghost. Like I didn't understand why the ghost plotline was even in there, because it felt like it was just really thrown in and it wasn't relevant to anything, and it was never really resolved. So I was like, why is this here? So like plot wise, as I was saying, it was cute, but there wasn't that much that was like great about it. Then I listened to the audiobook of Sawkill Girls by Claire Legrand, and this is a kind of contemporary fantasy about this island called Sawkill Rock, where girls have been going missing for generations and no one really knows why. People just kind of turn a blind eye to it. And we're following 3 girls, 2 of them who have been living on Sawkill Rock and 1 who has just moved there. And the 3 of them are tangled up in this mystery of like Sawkill Rock and why all of these girls are going missing and why it might be for supernatural reasons. And I feel like this book is really hard to explain what it's about. Like for some reason I feel like I'm struggling to explain what this story was, partially because it also just like went in a direction that I was not expecting it to go, which was interesting, and almost had some like it had some fantasy elements, but it also had some like almost sci-fi elements which were interesting too. It was just like a lot of things. One of the things that I really liked about this was that there are moments where we get the perspective of the rock, of like Sawkill Rock, which like I love, you know, nature magic, things where we're getting the perspective of like a sentient like land or nature or anything like that. So that was really interesting. I do think that this was very atmospheric, but for me, I don't feel like it translated well as an audiobook. There are also parts of the book that get into, I guess, like body horror. I'm not an expert on what body horror is, but I think there are parts of this that would count as body horror, and that are very like visceral, and I think those also I would have enjoyed more as like a physical read, but I still enjoy those parts as like an audio. I just think that there's just so much of this that I feel like I should have read this physically. But speaking of the like body horror parts of this, there would be content warnings for suicidal ideation, physical and emotional abuse, and maybe body horror if that's what it is. I'm not totally sure what the definition of that is. But the book does also have some rep in it that the main romance in this is a female-female romance, and there is a Black asexual main character as well. And overall, I did enjoy Sawkill Girls. I gave it 3.5 stars. Then the next book that I read was The 10,000 Doors of January by Alex E. Harrow, and this is kind of historical fiction slash fantasy-ish. So in this, we are following 2 stories really. So the first one, the main story, is of January. So January's father is often traveling away from home because his job is to find and bring back artifacts to his employer, who is this very wealthy older white man that employs him. And while her father is traveling, January lives with her father's employer. She is a biracial woman of color, and so she feels like she is always being like watched, and that she never quite fits in, but she learns to survive in this environment. But then one day her father disappears and she decides that she needs to go find him, and so she sets off on this adventure and starts to really find out the truths of her family and her family's history and this man that she has been living with for most of her life. Then the other story that we are following is this story in a book that January has found, that is this like love story of these two people from different worlds who have to like find each other, and all the adventures that they go on. And it's just like this love story that I think was very brief but also very compelling. I really liked the layering of the stories within the stories. There were elements of this that kind of reminded me of the Wayward Children series, just because this is a like portal fantasy and we find out about all of these different worlds that exist, and there is this emphasis on kind of like finding the world that is right for you. I really liked learning about all of these different worlds. It left me wanting more, but in a good way, because it felt like there was so much more to learn. I'm not usually a portal fantasy kind of person, but I really liked the way that this did it. It wasn't like too much. I've heard some people say that they wish that it was more like portal fantasy, but for me it was a really good balance, and I really enjoyed the amount of portal fantasy and like learning about the other worlds that we got. And I think that what we learned about the other worlds really made this universe that they were in feel very full and very rich, and like there was so much to learn about it. The only like complaint that I had about the kind of world building, I guess, was that sometimes the magic was a little underexplained or inconsistent. Like there weren't huge discrepancies, but once in a while things would happen that I would be like, that doesn't quite line up or quite make sense. I really enjoyed the main character in this, and that really this story is about following her own personal journey and learning more about herself and the world and her history, and finding her independence and forging her own life. This also had a lot of themes about change and being willing to change, or afraid of it, independence, belonging, otherness, being in between. It also had a lot about power, and power that is based on race, on gender, on money, and how those affect people. And this also touches on racism and patriarchy, but I do think that it's important to note that the main character in this, as I said, is a biracial woman of color, and it's part of it is about her experience with racism, but the author of this is a white woman, so it is not own voices for that rep. But overall, I did really enjoy this, and like when there were high intensity moments, I was totally into it, and I found the story really gripping. I really liked the character and the amount of growth that she goes through as she is really discovering herself and creating her new life. I feel like the story was really well put together, and I really liked the writing of it. I was listening to this actually as an audiobook, but even as an audiobook, I was really enjoying the storytelling and the way it was written. And really, I feel like this is actually kind of like what I wanted the Starless Sea to be. I definitely enjoyed this as a book about books. I definitely enjoyed this more than The Starless Sea, and I feel like while I was reading this, I kept thinking like, oh, this is actually more like what I wanted that to be, which really is kind of a beautifully written, kind of whimsical, magical book about storytelling that has a coherent plot. This has characters that I really enjoyed a lot more, that had a lot of growth and development over the story, and it also had a coherent plot. So I really enjoyed this. I gave it 4 stars. And then the last book that I read this month was What Should Be Wild by Julia Fine. And this was my least favorite book of the entire month. So what this is about. So this is about a girl who has the power to kill or resurrect with her touch. She is kept very secluded and then studied by her father, who is a scientist, kind of, until her father disappears, and then she has to go and find him. So in a lot of ways, this actually had a lot of like similar themes to the 10,000 Doors of January, but I really hated this. There also is a part of the story though where we are following, is it like 4 or 5 other women from different generations of her family, and kind of finding out about this generational curse that is on the family and on the surrounding land. So at first I was really into this book. When I first started it, I thought I was really going to like it. I liked it has a very like dark, macabre kind of atmosphere to it. And it has kind of like a magical forest in it, and so there were a lot of things that I think it had going for it at the beginning, and then it really went downhill. I really didn't like the main character in this. I was just tired of her very quickly in this book. I hated her relationship to literally every other character in the book. There were also like writing devices that I did not like in this. The most notable one to me was that this book talks about breasts and nipples so much. Like the author, like that's how the author measured time, I feel like. And while I was reading this, like one of my notes was just like, does the author know that the passage of time, characters aging, characters maturing, also just character emotions can be expressed in ways other than like through their breasts and nipples and like describing those? Like, does the author know this? It just got so annoying. There were also just so many inconsistencies in the magic that I kept being like, since when can she do that? And also that is like counter to everything I already know about how the magic works in this world. There were also a lot of loose ends in the storyline and things that just didn't make sense. The ending I felt was like kind of ridiculous, didn't really make sense, and was definitely anticlimactic. I just like, there were so many things about this, like I feel like I can't even fully express, like these are things that I dislike, but this book also just made me angry. Like I just hated it so much by the end. But also actually I want to mention there are also a lot of content warnings. I'm going to list a bunch of the ones that I have written down, but I feel like there are probably others that I missed. But definitely content warnings for suicide, death in childbirth, incest, kidnapping and Stockholm syndrome, gaslighting, physical abuse, drugging, a lot of stuff with blood and like cutting themselves or drawing blood, and killing animals. So there are a lot of content warnings on this. By the end of this book, I just hated it so much that like I had to like walk it off. Like I finished this book and was just like so angry that I took my dog for a walk, because I was like, otherwise I'm just gonna sit here and seethe about it, and I had to like walk off my emotions. So those are all of the books that I finished in May, and then I had 2 DNFs. The first one was Between the Water and the Woods by Simone Snaith, and this one I got pretty far apparently. I got 178 pages into this one. And then I also DNF'd Tarot by Marissa Kennerson, which I got 86 pages into. So that is all for my May wrap up. Please don't forget to check out the links in the description and support Black Lives Matter. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye!